On to our first speaker this afternoon, Professor Elspeth Jones. Elspeth is Emerita Professor of the Internationalisation of Higher Education at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. She's also the founding editor of the influential book series Internationalisation in Higher Education. She was awarded the inaugural North Star Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Transnational Research, and she's past recipient of the European Association for International Education Award for Excellence in Research. And Elspeth also hosts a YouTube channel featuring conversations with international educators. And I highly recommend that you have a look at that. I sat down with a cup of coffee this morning, and there are some really interesting conversations with people involved in this area of work in universities right across the world. So Professor Jones will talk to us today about connecting agendas and the transformational potential of internationalisation. So Elspeth, I'm going to hand the mic over to you and really look forward to hearing what you have to say on this.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and thank you to Queen's for inviting me for today's session. I'm looking forward to this. It always gives me a chance to rethink some of my ideas, and great to be here. So I'm going to try and pull up my PowerPoint, which I hope is going to be visible. If it's not, if somebody could tell me.
That's fine, Elspeth. We can see your slides.
Yeah, good. Okay. So we'll start from just, yeah, okay. So thanks very much, Eileen, also for mentioning the YouTube channel there. That's, it should be there, International Educator Conversations, and I'm just putting up some new ones at the moment. So if you're interested, please subscribe, and my Twitter handle's there. And I think the hashtag is QUBLTC 2022. So do feel free to make your comments there. So in today's session, I've got 6 kind of themes that I would like us to think about. Thinking about internationalisation, of course, and linking that to various institutional agendas, what I and a couple of other people have called an interculturalisation, but also problematising the idea of curriculum internationalisation. And what that means in practice when we're thinking of it at home rather than necessarily mobility. And I want to think about how it can be transformational to think in these terms. So hopefully it will suit your interests. I would like to begin, however, by mentioning these 3 questions, which you may have seen are already in the chat box. Do feel free to add anything in the chat box. If things come up that are particularly interesting, I may try to answer them as we're going along, but it's difficult to present and watch the chat box at the same time. So hopefully we'll have time at the end of the session to think about it, to think about these answers as well. In terms of the context, I wanted us to just remind ourselves of a few points here. So we're all familiar with the idea of globalization by now, and I guess in some respects the global pandemic has caused us to be more connected online, perhaps with people, even friends in different parts of the world that we perhaps wait to see rather than necessarily connect with other ways. But globalization itself, the way that we consume, the way that we receive our goods, the way we think about the world, globalization has somehow made the world seem smaller. But there's still a danger that has not changed the notion of thinking about in terms of foreignness, as it were, of us and them. So the otherization of people that we view to be different from ourselves, or to be less good than ourselves, or to think differently. And that idea of in-group or out-group bias, and even unconscious bias around these topics is still very, very prevalent. And I don't know if you've heard of this idea of my side bias, and linking that to the post-truth society, but I find this quite interesting. So it's a common type of cognitive bias, and people process information apparently in ways in which they are already biased towards that information. So it just confirms their own prior beliefs, opinions and attitudes. And I guess if you're probably thinking of examples of this at the moment, but one example would be, for example, conspiracy theories, or people who, I'm speaking from my own perspective. The Brexit debate was very, very polarized, and we couldn't really change people's opinions. The idea being that once you've got fixed ideas in your head, that's very difficult to shift. So that kind of my side bias, I think, is something that we need to try and counter. So all of this links in with what I view as this broader view of internationalization. And I think we need to be thinking instead about a border crossing approach to pedagogy, where we need to think beyond not only physical borders, but cultural borders, which can sometimes cause us to think about these historically constructed and socially organized borders that we may have in our heads, or in society more generally, where these rules and regulations can either limit or exclude or pathologize particular identities, individual capacities and social forms. So Henry Giroux writes about this idea of border crossings, and Louise Townsend, if you're interested, one of the videos in the series is with Louise Townsend, who has used this herself and wrote her PhD around this. So trying to think more broadly about internationalization, for me, causes us to think about a whole range of different questions, of some of this context that we find ourselves in the present day, in very polarized world in many respects, certainly polarized politically and polarized in other respects as well. So I'd like us to think about internationalization in this context. And in terms of this, you may be familiar with the definition that was written as part of the European Parliament study in 2015. Hans de Wit and colleagues amended Jane Knight's version of the definition of internationalization to point out that it needs to be intentional. We can't just assume that we might send students to another country, or we have international students in our classrooms, and that they're, by a process of osmosis almost, we develop an international mindset, global mindset. It needs to be intentional. And they've added this idea in bold at the bottom there to say that this is all about enhancing the quality of education and research, and specifically it's for all students and staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. Okay, so this is the definition that I prefer to use, and is very prevalent at the moment. But in contrast to that, instead, we find that internationalization is still really focusing on mobility, the presence of international students. Across Europe, obviously, we've been very lucky in having the Erasmus scheme to support that mobility. And I think in a way that's caused a kind of almost a narrowing of mindsets around what we understand by internationalization. So in some respects, it's been helpful, and in other respects, it's been less so. So again, this is a slight issue for us. The rationales for curriculum internationalization then, or for internationalization in general, we've got the pragmatically based rationale, where we're talking about skills and understandings, often about employment and employability. But instead today I want to focus a little bit more on the values-based rationale, linked with some of those concepts there, global citizenship, responsibility, and so on, the things that I mentioned. And we're going to be coming back to all of these points. So the more values-based rationale is less focused on the output, as it were, of internationalization, and more thinking of a transformative approach which will help to change mindsets in our students. Now, that we do know, however, that that certainly international mobility helps develop skills through which will be useful either in terms of employability as you can see down the left-hand side, or in terms of intercultural competence, because we've found, not only I, but many people have found that what I've termed employability skills versus intercultural competence skills are developed through international experiences if it is done in the right way, if we help our students to make the most of those opportunities. So yes, it does develop employability skills and it does develop intercultural competence skills, but mobility is very much an elite, for something which only the elite can profit from. It's some very, very minute percentage of the world's student population can be mobile as part of their studies. And taking a more equitable approach to this, we need to focus on internationalization of the curriculum for all our students, which will be probably 98% of them who are not mobile. And we need to think about changing mindsets rather than moving bodies in that values-based approach to internationalization. So yes, mobility is great, but it should be seen as adding value to an already internationalized curriculum rather than being the main purpose of our internationalization efforts. So that's thinking generally about internationalization, but linking this now to various institutional agendas, which you may be, I'm sure you're familiar with, but the point being that I believe we need to take a much broader approach to our thinking around internationalization itself and linking it to other things that are happening. So, for example, I'm sure the various universities represented here today, you're already looking at some of these issues around equality, equity, diversity, inclusion, around access and widening participation, trying to get as many people as possible involved in university life and not giving them the opportunities of having a higher education. We've also got then the issue around education for sustainable development. The United Nations SDGs are very much in people's minds when they're thinking about internationalization. Obviously, we can contribute in many different ways depending on our discipline area, but it's also about the less tangible, non-discipline related areas where we learn to cross those boundaries and think interculturally and internationally, use communication skills and use our critical thinking skills, which can be developed through internationalization. And that these are all going to contribute to hopefully succeeding in these very challenging development goals that the world has been set. We've then got decolonization of the curriculum, which is a very prevalent debate today. And what we do find is that if we see if we take an Anglo-Western approach and largely white approach to the curriculum, to research, learning and teaching, this may perpetuate the global power relations which have caused so many difficulties in the past. They can normalize inequalities and minimize potential contribution of the epistemologies which diverse voices can bring to thinking about higher education. So while we focus too much on an Anglo-Western approach, we almost dismiss or ignore the opportunities presented by the epistemologies that some of our students may bring, the different ways of thinking, different ways of imagining curricula and ways forward in bringing all of these different agendas together. There's also increasing diversity in society, of course. We're trying to change courses to programs to bring in opportunities for people to recognise that diversity within both local and global communities, because as Sharon Stein says here, the dominant social imaginaries and patterns of Euro supremacy can be reinforced if we don't reconsider curricula with paying attention to the diversity in society. And in fact, as far as society is concerned, I don't know if you've heard of this particular initiative, which is a relatively recent development. although it's been happening in many places around the world, what we've tried to do is bring it together as a strategy linked to the third mission of universities, trying to internationalize the third mission and trying to think about third mission when we think about internationalization of the curriculum. So if you want to read more about that, there are various articles written on that, along those lines. At the same time, we need to remind ourselves that internationalization is not only to do with other countries. And as I say, I've used this term interculturalization, which is tricky, but basically we need to think interculturally as well as internationally in order to try to bring about some of the changes that I'm talking about and I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So internationalization, I feel, is really the wrong term. It makes us think about other countries, whereas in fact we need to think much more broadly. And in fact, I've forgotten his first name, Robertson said in 1992, he talked about the concept of globality, consciousness of the world as a single place, and we need to be conscious of our place within that and our potential contribution to the world and to society at large. So we've talked about related concepts within the agendas of various of the institution, but we also have various concepts within society which are linked to this as well. And so all of these different areas, whether it's to do with anti-racism, inclusivity, social responsibility, global power relations, which can affect the way we all interact, and all of these different dimensions, I believe, are linked to a concept of internationalization, which we are not really addressing to any great degree at the moment. So moving on to thinking about interculturalization, I've written about this on a number of occasions, and I've said that we need to create the potential for our students to question their own assumptions and acknowledge viewpoints crossing cultural boundaries by respecting and valuing diversity as essential for living and learning in a changing society. So this is the basis of it, and using culture in quite specific ways, which I'll come to in a second. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Council of Europe's approach to this, where they've talked about competencies for democratic culture. And if you're interested in this, you can just Google the term and you'll see a whole range of different and interesting documents on this, talking about how to bring about these changes in values or attitudes, knowledge and critical understanding or skills, which will help people to live together in a more tolerant way, as it were, living as equals in culturally diverse democratic societies, as they say. And so this has been recognised at European Union level, European Council of Europe level, in fact, which is wider than just the European Union. And it's coming together in this range of ideas, which I think is very interesting. But basically, we're trying to get people to not keep their own viewpoint as the prime viewpoint, to challenge personal assumptions, biases, unconscious or not, stereotypes which they may have, and to develop a more sort of cultural humility, which you may have heard about. My way is not necessarily the best way. Just because I've only known this way doesn't mean this is the only way to think. And so, as the cartoon shows, seeing things from another perspective, or indeed other perspectives, and thinking about the world and one's discipline, thinking about living as in society which is more varied, more diverse, and how we actually help our students to develop those skills and reduce biases and stereotypes, I think is all part of the same thing. Now, I talked about cultural diversity, and we'll be familiar with some of the things which are on the left there. when we think about diverse students or diversity in society. When it comes to thinking interculturally, I think we need also to look at those on the right-hand side there, students who may be mature or first in family to attend the university. They could be working. They may have caring responsibilities. Even those who've come from a rural area to study in a city can have very different perspectives from students who've grown up in a city and been there forever. I've mentioned also traveller communities, which I think is particularly relevant, certainly in parts of the island of Ireland. And Indigenous communities would, for example, in Australia or Canada or other parts of the world, equally so. We need to be thinking about cultural diversity in different ways. Now, my thinking on this has been influenced by Adrian Holiday, who's written about large culture versus small culture. And he said that when we talk about culture, we tend, the default notion is a large culture concept relating, for example, to nationality or ethnicity. So we'll refer to, I don't know, Indian students or Chinese students as though they're all the same type of person. But of course, we all have a whole range of identities within ourselves. We've all got different interests and different histories, and we are made up of a whole range of what he calls small cultures, where small social groupings or activities, wherever there's cohesive behaviour, we need to think about diversity in those terms. So, for example, if you're involved in a singing group, or if you follow a certain type of musician, if you like Japanese manga or K-pop, or if you're a fan of Star Wars or Star Trek, you will have in common with others who have those interests a certain set of codes, in a way, certain set of understandings and behaviours which may be cohesive to that group, but not necessarily understood by other people. And so this idea of small culture, as opposed to big religious or national cultures, I think provides us with some quite interesting ideas in terms of how we bring this into our classrooms and into our curricula. So I hope I'm not going too quickly along here, and I hope you're maybe adding into the chat box. I can't see that right at the moment, but we'll have plenty of time to talk about this towards the end. So in summary, I think we need to think in terms of using that very broad sense of diversity as a resource, the cultural diversity in small culture terms, which I think can help us move towards transformative internationalization, because this, I believe, can come through not just international experiences, but, as I've said, constructive engagement with perceived cultural otherness of any kind. And I want to just unpack that a second, because the perceived is very, very important. The otherness is when you view the other person as having a different set of cultural experiences from yourself. It doesn't mean that they are different and you are normal, but it means that you perceive this otherness in other people. And in fact, you may then use this as a learning opportunity yourself, but equally, I think we may bring this into the classroom and use it for pedagogical opportunities. Now, in terms of that pedagogy, in terms of examples of cultural otherness in the wider community, I've divided this here into community, businesses, and other kinds of organisation. And the reason why I've chosen these particular ones is that in most cases, I have had experience of working with these various types of organisation, businesses, community groups in my previous life at Leeds Beckett University. So working in partnership with some of these organisations to build in opportunities for our students to learn about what they perceive as cultural others. So, for example, if we take the idea of people who are homeless, if you have not experienced homelessness, you don't know anybody who's been homeless, but you, for example, volunteer in a shelter for homeless people, then you immediately see that a different world, view things from a different perspective than if you have never experienced that. In the same way, working with refugees or asylum seekers could open your eyes in a way that you have not experienced before. So these are just some examples of how we can encourage our students to engage with cultural otherness in the wider community. And I believe we can do this through the curriculum. So it will depend on the nature of your curriculum as to which would be appropriate. But I believe we can also do that in what I'll refer to later as the informal curriculum, where it's a university-wide initiative, where there are, for example, volunteering opportunities or a specific initiative which engages students with some of these groups or individuals from these organisations. So moving on then to thinking about curriculum, I think we need to first of all slightly problematize what we understand by this, because very often when you say curriculum, people think of it as a syllabus, and in fact it's much broader than this. And Ron Barnett talks about the course of study itself, the program of study, the teaching and learning processes, the assessment processes, and the student experience of learning beyond the classroom. Now, Betty Lesk uses this. Betty Lesk is the premier writer on internationalization of the curriculum, and she is a great expert in this area. And she has adapted these into how we can internationalize the curriculum along these lines. And we need to think in terms of, this is not necessarily Betty's view, this is my view here, but in terms of curriculum internationalization, we need to think beyond case studies and global reading lists. We need to think about more inclusive border crossing, as I mentioned earlier, questioning our own aspects of practice and considering issues from alternative global perspectives ourselves so that we can help our students to think differently, helping students to question their identities and dominant ways of thinking by also doing that ourselves. And as I mentioned earlier, cultural humility and minimizing unconscious bias, prejudice and stereotyping. Now, as I mentioned, Betty Lesk, she writes in particular not only about those four aspects that Ron Barnett talks about, but she also talks about the hidden curriculum aspects which we may fail to consider in any aspect of curriculum. So, for example, whose knowledge is privileged in curriculum design? I mentioned earlier alternative epistemologies which we may not take into account. But then even some basic things like scheduling exams on feast days of religions which we haven't taken into account, for example, or not explaining academic culture. The one that I guess you're most familiar with will be the formal curriculum, but there's also then the non-assessed informal curriculum. And I'm going to just give some examples of some of these. So internationalizing the informal curriculum, then events, activities, programs arranged by the university but not accredited within the main program of study. And here's just a slide showing some examples from my own university of things that we did, but I'm sure you do many of these things. And the idea being that you want to create an international and intercultural campus on the culture on the campus, and being open and diverse, welcoming to people from many different backgrounds. In terms of the hidden curriculum, as I mentioned, the hidden messages which are loaded with cultural assumptions, but firstly we may overlook them, but more importantly we're often unaware of them. We don't even think about them sometimes. Just a couple of examples here then. Academic expectations in terms of lectures. People from different parts of the world will respond to lectures in different ways. So, for example, I've had West African students who want to lay out the context and help them to reach the conclusion that the lecturer is drawing. So they want to see the context before they move towards the conclusion. In Scandinavia, the tendency is to try to get to the point more quickly and then give an explanation. And then in Turkey and other countries, listening may be more important than speaking. Don't ask me to say anything because I haven't necessarily understood yet. I need to process it. I need to think about it more carefully. And some Chinese students may think that they want to record the session so they can listen again to what's been said in order to memorize, which helps them to learn more efficiently. So just to say that these are perhaps, I'm not saying that every student adopts one of these mindsets, as it were, towards their lectures, but it is possible that people from different parts of the world have different expectations of lectures, and we don't always remind ourselves that we need to speak in ways that everybody will be able to take account of, to take also, not to take for granted that people will understand our lectures, because not just simply the use of English or the use of the language, but because they have a different approach to understanding lectures, and we haven't even thought about that. But in a way, a lot more insidious is the fact that, as I say, we whose knowledges we're valuing, and the epistemologies and methods which we value tend to be, we can tend to think only in the terms in which we ourselves have been educated. And we need to think instead, we need to challenge the deficit paradigms of the idea that other ways of thinking are less good than ours, possibly Anglo-Western view of curriculum. And we need to challenge ourselves to think differently in terms of curriculum design and delivery, acknowledging and embracing, where possible, other ways of thinking and doing. And as I've written with Hans de Witt, this idea of an uncritical domination of Anglo and Eurocentric worldviews can actually be a barrier to the way we think about internationalization. We don't learn enough from other contexts which are non-Western, as it were, so non-Anglo-Eurocentric. We must try to learn more and learn from other people who think in different ways. So now coming to the formal curriculum itself, this is perhaps, as I say, the most familiar to you, the aspects of the programme which are assessed and have specified intended learning outcomes associated with them. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure many of you, with the idea of setting out intended learning outcomes which lead to teaching and learning processes, which lead to assessment processes, and they link together. But what does this mean for us in terms of internationalizing the curriculum then? We need to think about internationalizing those intended learning outcomes. And here I'm just going to show a model of how internationalization of the curriculum links with that idea of constructive alignment of the curriculum, which you may, as I say, you may already be familiar with. Importantly, it begins with the discipline area. So you can't internationalize a curriculum in a single way. Every discipline area will be different, and indeed every university will be different. Even though it's the same curriculum, if it's in a different university or in other universities, it will be different from your own. So being specific about disciplinary in your context is very important as a starting point for thinking about internationalizing the curriculum. We then need to think about, at the end of the programme, what knowledge, skills and attitudes will our graduates be able to demonstrate specific to our discipline? And then working backwards from there, what does this mean for the end of the first year and the second year and so on? So what will we expect of them after each of those years? How will learning outcomes need to change in terms of internationalizing the learning outcomes, the intended learning outcomes for our students? And how will we assess whether the students have achieved those outcomes, and what does this mean for the classroom, for pedagogy in general, and how am I going to amend the pedagogy to achieve this? So to give you a hard example, I want to just look at some work that we did at Leeds Beckett when we were thinking about internationalizing learning outcomes. And we took the view, we had a number of attempts. We began in 2003. We had another attempt then in 2010, and tried to incorporate learnings from the previous time into the subsequent effort. And we brought together a group of people from across the university, different faculties, to look at each other's learning outcomes and to try to suggest how they might be made more internationalized. We didn't impose this, we just made some suggestions, and I'm going to show you some examples now. So the one on the left was the learning outcome that came to us, and in discussion with people from other discipline areas, we suggested that we add that the team from where the original learning outcome came from looked at two contrasting international business environments, because in discussion we agreed that if you just say in the international business environment, it's not clear that you're thinking from more than one perspective. It could be simply the international business environment from a local perspective. So we suggested that this would be helpful. The modified learning outcome was not then imposed upon the team. As I say, it was sent back to the team, who were then able to discuss it themselves and to decide whether that was a good way forward or whether they wanted to change it in a slightly different way. So that's the first example. We then, here's one in relation to ethics in science. And we suggested that they made specific the idea of it being a multicultural society. So the ethical responsibilities of science in relation to a multicultural society. So the team said that actually this was understood in their curriculum. Of course, it was a multicultural society, but we also pointed out that there are many, well, these learning, first of all, the learning outcomes are shared with students. So the students didn't necessarily understand that, but equally, it was important that if there was, for example, a replacement teacher who came in to deliver a module, they also needed to understand that that was implicit in the learning outcomes and that this should be delivered and taught in this way. So I think it was a useful discussion to have, and people were able to then take this back to their teams and have further discussions about it. In the next one, this is actually perhaps a more global, the legal issues relevant to the professional environment of the discipline is actually wider than just a single discipline area. But basically, we suggested simply adding the global professional environment of their discipline. Now, obviously, it's easy to add a single word, but going back to the diagram around the constructive alignment of curriculum, this then implies that you have to teach and deliver in a certain way, you have to assess in a certain way. So this is simply a starting point. Obviously, the intended learning outcomes are simply a starting point for all of this. A couple more examples before we move on. The market data collection, which takes account of the diversity of the target population. Again, they said it was implicit, but of course, we need to make it explicit, I believe. And then Financial Conduct, Financial Services and Marketing Act, as they arise in the context of relevant transactions to a client accustomed to operating in a different national context. So always thinking that there may be somebody who doesn't quite understand things in the same way as you do, really. And the last example, different components of fitness, with appropriate reference to issues of race, gender, cultural contexts. We might have added others in there as well, but these were just the ones that we suggested at the time. And the changing context of the wider sector, the changing local and global context of the wider sector. So as I say, even though we think of this as being implicit and understood in our curriculum, it won't be understood by everybody in the same way. So I think this is actually quite important. Now, moving on to what internationalisation of the curriculum at home means in practice then. It's relevant for a whole range of disciplines. I believe it's relevant for every single discipline, because even if your discipline isn't mentioned here, some people talk about maths or physics being outside of the need to do this. But in fact, in those disciplines, you're always working, I would say always working in international teams and having to relate and engage with people from different cultural backgrounds, different national backgrounds, different more local, small culture backgrounds as well. So we're always engaging with people in those disciplines, and we need to be developing the kind of the values-based internationalization that I mentioned earlier. So what does this mean in the context of your discipline and your curriculum? And so we need to, I'm hoping you're answering these questions in the chat box, by the way, and we'll come to those later, but recognizing the connections that I've tried to point out between the agendas, either of the institution or of society, thinking then in terms of internationalization as this very broad concept, and thinking about the transformational potential of internationalization in changing mindsets, both in our students and therefore linking that into society as well, and recognizing local, regional, national and global links. I'm going to just give a few examples now from an article I had published recently. These, I think, are some of the next steps that we can take. Developing intended learning outcomes which are appropriate to the discipline, the student body, the local, regional, institutional context, as I've said. Thinking about relevant, achievable, appropriate pedagogical approaches to deliver and assess those learning outcomes, and making sure that they're embedded within the core curriculum rather than added on, for example, as electives. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that internationalization is for 100% of our students, not simply the very few who take part in mobility exchanges. Secondly, we need to focus on learning outcomes that require all students to encounter and challenge their own perspectives through meaningful and engaged connection with those who may reflect a broader range of cultural otherness than they've previously experienced. And these may include, as I've said, the community groups, business organisations and other kinds of organisation that I gave examples of earlier. We also need to, importantly, provide guided opportunities for reflection on their experiences. So we can't simply put them in these contexts of cultural otherness, but we need to help them to reflect on what they've experienced as part of an inclusive approach to pedagogy. So it could be about diversity in the classroom or the wider context through group work. It could be engagement with diversity in the local context, again, in those types of organisations I mentioned. It could be virtual exchange or COIL opportunities, collaborative online international learning through digital means. It could be also looking at those students who have come back from study abroad or education abroad experiences and helping students to learn from those experiences across the whole group. So these are just some obvious examples of that. And finally, I want to think about the transformational potential of internationalization. Hopefully you've gathered from what I've been saying so far that I view all of these initiatives as potential, having potential for transformation, but obviously we need to make it happen. And I think therefore this attitudinal or mindset change is absolutely crucial, helping our students through the existing curriculum, not adding it on, amending what we've already got, changing the learning outcomes that we already have to help them to do some of these things, exploring identities, values and beliefs, challenging assumptions, viewing things from the perspective of others, making the familiar strange, which is an ethnographic technique, helping them to doubt the superiority of their own cultural values, that cultural humility, and thinking globally as well as locally. So, a very interesting article by Lily, Barker and Harris found, in fact, that these were the circumstances which triggered those student accounts of personal change or transformation. So experiences, encounters, relationships and role models. And very importantly, they found that these could equally be co-nationals and not simply being part of an international, i.e. a mobility experience. So they found that these things triggered a transformation within student accounts. And so it's very interesting that we need to do more of this research about the internationalization at home dimension and the intercultural dimension in terms of small culture. So there's still a long way to go, but we're beginning to see some results. And the role of the academic then in terms of pedagogy is to create those challenging intercultural learning opportunities, again, which are appropriate to the discipline, to the students that you have in front of you, with those relevant learning outcomes and the assessment to show that these have been achieved.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to say there's just another couple of minutes left now.
Yes, I'm just on my last slide. And here, this is my idea that we're looking at providing guided opportunity for reflection on experience of cultural otherness. And we need to think about why we're doing it, preparing students for the task. When they're on task, asking them questions, ethnographic questions, and observing them, and then bringing them back to analyse and reflect on the task. Okay, so thank you very much. These are the things that I hope we've covered today, and I'm very interested to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Elspeth. That was a very broad-ranging, but also really practical. You've given us lots of examples of things that you've already tried. And I really appreciate your honesty when you say you tried something with your colleagues in 2003 and then you came back to it again in 2010, because sometimes I think that's the way that things work in universities. So I'm just wondering, do we have, I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. We have about 7 minutes for questions for Elspeth, and of course she has posed a few questions for us. So I'm just having a quick look to see if these are comments or whether there are questions here.
Sorry to interrupt, but Elspeth, you're still sharing your screen there.
Am I?
Yes.
I'm having such trouble with this.
Elspeth, if you just click the little X button on the toolbar that pops up there.
Yes.
Yeah, that will stop
I've
sharing
done
your
it.
screen. Perfect.
Are we done?
We're done.
Okay, thank you.
So do we have any questions at this stage? I mean, I can certainly see a comment from Maria Lee about internationalisation and how it links to other agendas such as EDI and employability. And I think you touched on that briefly, Elspeth. I'm not sure if there's more that you would want to say on that.
Okay, well, obviously, I think I've tried to explain how the small culture approach means that we think of EDI perhaps in a slightly different way, and that we try to expand our concepts of diversity into perhaps things that we don't always think of. You know, that there tend to be a group of ranges of aspects of diversity that we're encouraged to think of all the time. But I think we need to perhaps broaden some of those ideas. Employability, there's been a lot of research in terms of the international experiences, but there's been much less in terms of internationalization at home and employability. But we do know that those kinds of skills are developed in the international context. So if you're interested in that kind of more that aspect, that dimension of internationalization, it's a question of looking to see how those skills can be developed alongside, you know, within the local domestic context.
Yes, and you used a phrase earlier on that I thought was really helpful, actually. Internationalization being more about changing mindsets than moving bodies around the world. I suppose in the last couple of years, we've maybe learned a little bit more about how we might make some changes without actually having to physically move bodies. So I can see that Declan McLaughlin.
Fantastic question. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't know if people can see it. Is internationalization or decolonization less of an issue when international staff are driving things? It's not always. The problem is that quite often the international staff get institutionalized, and it can be that they can feel as though they're out on a limb and nobody's listening to them. So I think that could be a great opportunity, but I think it's also up to the institution to allow for that to happen more than perhaps it does at the moment. I think yes, again, if you come, and learning from our students as well, as students as partners approach, if we involve students from diverse backgrounds, including international students, then hopefully we can see things from alternative perspectives and know where we need to do more, where we need to make more effort. So yes, that's a really great question, Declan. Thank you for that. I've got another one here from Siba. Okay. What do you have for suggestions for the institutions and academics in the Global South in facilitating this? I'm guessing you mean when you say in the Global South, not from the Global South, Siba. I think the problem is that, again, internationalization has been so dominated by Anglo-Western thinking, Eurocentric thinking, US, Australia, that I think we're only really beginning to get to the point where people in the Global South are feeling that they are able to move outside of that kind of conceptualization of internationalization. And so I think my main suggestion would be confident, realize that there are opportunities presented by institutions and academics in the Global South to re-educate, in a way, people from places where internationalization has been more dominant. And so I think the confidence to publish, the confidence to share through conferences, the confidence to realize that local epistemologies, local ways of thinking and doing can really add to the questions that we're posing ourselves. So I think it's really important that those of us who are interested in this area, try to support and encourage people from the Global South to do those things, to publish, to present in conferences, and to be confident about what they can contribute.
Thanks, Elspeth. We have time for one more quick question, if people have anything that they'd like to talk to Elspeth about at this point. I don't think.
Thank you very much to everyone for all the comments. By the way, there are a lot of comments, but not so much questions that I can see. But anyway, that's great that you've added your comments there. Thank you so much.
I can't see any hands up at the moment, and I can't see any more questions coming through. Actually, I can just see a hand up at the moment. I can see that Elida, do you have a question that you'd like to put to Elspeth?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jones. It was a really interesting presentation. You said that in your university at Leeds,
yes,
you had two initiatives basically for the curriculum.
Yeah,
I was interested to know like what worked, what didn't, because from 2010 it's quite a long experience. If you could share more on that.
Yeah.
And,
yeah. I retired not long after that, so I'm afraid I'm not involved in the detail of that anymore, unfortunately. But I think we found that the first initiative we used the 5-year review process, and we published a document which to help people review their curriculum in terms of internationalization. If you want to drop me a note, was it Emma? If you no, sorry, is it? Sorry, Elida, yeah. If you want to drop me an email, Elida, I can pass some information to you about what we did. There are various documents on the web which show what we've done or what we did. And then the second time around, we were more. I think that the problem that happened first time around was that we didn't sufficiently follow up. We had a website where people added their what they had done, and other people could see what had been done, but we didn't then go back to them sufficiently to try and challenge where they were going. In the second case, we did the initiative that I mentioned around the learning outcomes, and we were then trying to follow that through to see what happened in the student body, and that would be the next step. So yeah, but I'm happy to send you some documentation if you want to drop me a note.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Elspeth. I can see another hand.
Sarah Prince, I think.
I wonder if it was a very, very quick question, Sarah. Otherwise, we're going to be running late into our next lot of presentations.
Sorry, apologies for the lateness of my question asking. I was just wondering, I mean, it's a really fascinating presentation you've given, Elspeth. We've really enjoyed it, particularly us at INTU, we're an international school. And one of the things I was really curious about is, in terms of the pandemic, what do you think the opportunities the pandemic and the changes in delivery provide for internationalisation of the curriculum?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it's caused people to think differently about how we deliver. It's caused people to think to see other countries perhaps as being closer. And I mean, it's very, very basic in a way, isn't it? By using your contacts in other countries to think about how you can bring together the communities in your own university and another one, as long as the university's facilitated many connections of that type. It's then down to creativity in terms of how you use that opportunity and how you devise tasks, which I don't know if you know about this collaborative online international learning, COIL. Again, there are some videos. Some of the videos in my series talk about this, but it's actually thinking about how to be very creative in using COIL, not thinking of it as a technological tool, using that as simply the tool, not the main objective. You still have to have a really clever, innovative approach to curriculum and design. And there's a very interesting video with Eva Howe from University of Amsterdam Applied Sciences, and she's quite an important person to think about in these terms. But I do think, yes, it's caused us to think very rapidly about how we can deliver in different ways. Thank you for the question.